As fighting across Ukraine grinds through another phase of sustained intensity, new information emerging from open-source intelligence, satellite imagery, intercepted logistics data, and battlefield reporting points to mounting strain inside Russia's military supply system. Units deployed along extended front lines are facing persistent shortages of food, basic equipment, medical supplies, and transport capacity, even as official messaging from Moscow continues to project confidence and imminent success. The contrast between public declarations of strength and the private realities reported from the field has become one of the defining features of the conflict's current stage, carrying consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. Over recent months, Russian forces have operated under conditions that increasingly resemble logistical exhaustion. Supply convoys moving from depots in western Russia toward occupied territories have become less frequent, more fragmented, and more vulnerable to disruption. Rail hubs, once critical to sustaining large-scale operations, are working below capacity due to infrastructure damage, labor shortages, and competing civilian demands. As a result, frontline units have reported irregular meal distribution, reliance on outdated ration stocks, and improvised solutions that fall far short of military standards expected in a prolonged war. This deterioration has not occurred suddenly. It is the cumulative outcome of structural weaknesses that were present long before the invasion began. Russia's military logistics doctrine was designed for short, decisive operations close to its borders, not for an extended, high-intensity campaign stretching hundreds of kilometers into contested territory. Early assumptions that Ukrainian resistance would collapse quickly shaped procurement, stockpiling, and transport planning. When those assumptions proved false, the system struggled to adapt at the scale and speed required. Food supply has emerged as a particularly revealing indicator of broader stress. Soldiers in several sectors have described receiving reduced portions or relying on local sourcing in areas already depleted by fighting. In some cases, units have depended on volunteer groups or private donations to supplement official provisions. While such stopgap measures may alleviate immediate hardship, they underscore the gap between institutional capacity and operational demand. Sustaining morale becomes increasingly difficult when basic needs are uncertain, especially under constant threat. At the same time, the Kremlin's communication strategy has remained focused on projecting momentum and resilience. State media continues to emphasize territorial control, industrial mobilization, and national unity. Victory narratives are reinforced through carefully curated images and language that leave little room for acknowledging material shortages or human cost. This approach reflects a long-standing reliance on information control as a strategic tool, but it also creates risks when discrepancies between official claims and lived experience become impossible to ignore. The economic dimensions of these shortages are inseparable from the military picture. Sanctions imposed since the start of the invasion have constrained Russia's access to key technologies, spare parts, and financial channels. While the country has adapted in some areas through rerouting trade and expanding domestic production, these adjustments come with inefficiencies and delays. Inflationary pressure, labor reallocation to defense industries, and declining investment in non-military sectors all contribute to a tighter resource environment. Military logistics, which depend on civilian manufacturing and transport networks, inevitably feel these pressures. Historically, logistics has often determined the outcome of large-scale conflicts involving Russia. From the Eastern Front of the Second World War to later engagements, the ability to move food, fuel, and ammunition across vast distances has repeatedly proven decisive. The current conflict revives these historical patterns under modern conditions, where precision strikes, surveillance, and rapid information flow magnify the consequences of logistical failure. What once could be concealed for months can now become visible within days. Social consequences within Russia are also becoming more pronounced. Families of deployed soldiers increasingly rely on informal networks to send supplies, raising questions about state responsibility and equity. Regional disparities are widening as wealthier areas can mobilize resources more effectively than poorer regions. This uneven burden feeds into existing social tensions and complicates the narrative of collective sacrifice promoted by the government. Internationally, reports of shortages are closely monitored by governments and analysts assessing the conflict's trajectory. Allies of Ukraine view logistical strain as evidence that sustained support can alter battlefield dynamics over time. Neutral states weigh the implications for regional stability and global food and energy markets. Russia's partners, while publicly supportive, must consider the long-term sustainability of a war effort that draws heavily on economic and human capital. The gap between propaganda and reality does not automatically translate into immediate strategic collapse. Large states possess significant buffers, and Russia retains substantial resources. However, prolonged mismatch between objectives and capacity can erode effectiveness incrementally. Units operating without reliable supply lines become reactive rather than proactive, limiting operational flexibility and increasing casualties from preventable causes such as exposure, illness, and fatigue. Political implications of these developments are complex and layered. Within Russia's leadership structure, competing priorities between military commanders, regional authorities, and economic planners create friction over resource allocation. Maintaining the appearance of strength is essential to political legitimacy, yet addressing logistical failures requires acknowledgement and reform. This tension shapes decision-making and slows corrective action, particularly in a system where bad news is often filtered before reaching senior levels. The human impact on soldiers themselves remains largely invisible in official discourse. Extended deployments, limited rest, and uncertainty over basic provisions place significant strain on physical and mental resilience. While morale is influenced by ideology and unit cohesion, it is also deeply tied to material conditions. When soldiers perceive a disconnect between rhetoric and reality, trust erodes, affecting discipline and effectiveness. These dynamics are difficult to quantify, but are critical to understanding operational outcomes. Economic ripple effects extend beyond Russia's borders. Disruptions to agricultural production, transport routes, and energy infrastructure linked to the conflict influence global markets. Rising costs and uncertainty affect import-dependent countries, particularly in regions already vulnerable to price shocks. As military needs absorb a larger share of resources, civilian sectors face constraints that can reduce export capacity and fiscal stability. Reactions from international institutions have emphasized the long-term nature of these challenges. Analysts highlight that logistical endurance, rather than short-term battlefield gains, will likely determine strategic leverage. Military aid, sanctions policy, and diplomatic engagement are increasingly calibrated with an eye toward sustainability over years rather than months. In this context, reports of shortages acquire significance as indicators of systemic pressure. Looking ahead, the trajectory of Russia's supply situation will depend on several interacting factors. Industrial output, transportation security, labor availability, and political will all play roles. Adaptation is possible, but it carries costs and trade-offs that may limit flexibility elsewhere. The conflict thus enters a phase where endurance, management, and credibility become as important as firepower, shaping not only military outcomes but the broader international order. These pressures accumulate over time, altering calculations on all sides. For Russia, sustaining operations while preserving domestic stability becomes an increasingly delicate balance. For observers, the evolving logistics picture offers insight into how modern wars are fought and sustained under intense economic and informational constraints. The outcome of this balance will not be determined by a single moment, but by continuous adjustment under stress, where the ability to provide something as basic as food becomes a measure of strategic capacity as consequential as any battlefield maneuver. In that sense, the current shortages represent more than logistical difficulties. They reflect the broader challenge of sustaining a prolonged war in a tightly interconnected global environment where weaknesses are quickly exposed and difficult to conceal. This reality continues to shape assessments of the conflict's direction and its wider implications for security, governance, and economic resilience worldwide. The situation remains fluid, but the underlying pressures outlined here persist, demanding close attention as events unfold across the region. These factors collectively define the environment in which decisions are now being made. Ongoing scrutiny The continuation of these dynamics deepens the significance of supply stress as a strategic factor rather than a temporary setback. As the war extends, logistical strain interacts with institutional habits that shape how problems are addressed. Russian military culture has historically emphasized hierarchy and discipline, sometimes at the expense of rapid feedback from lower levels. In the current environment, this can delay recognition of shortages until they reach critical levels. Reports indicating that requests for additional provisions move slowly through administrative channels reflect this structural challenge, reinforcing inefficiencies already present under wartime pressure. The industrial base supporting the war effort is operating under intense demand. Factories producing uniforms, preserved food, vehicles, and ammunition face constraints linked to workforce availability, imported components, and energy costs. While output has increased in certain sectors, expansion is uneven. Smaller subcontractors struggle to secure financing and raw materials, creating bottlenecks that ripple through the supply chain. The result is a system capable of generating volume in specific categories, but less able to ensure consistent quality and distribution across all units. Transportation remains a critical vulnerability. Long-distance movement of supplies depends on rail and road networks that are under constant surveillance and, at times, direct attack. Even when routes remain technically open, security measures and rerouting add delays. Fuel shortages compound these issues. As transport assets compete with combat units for limited reserves, each delay increases uncertainty at the front, forcing commanders to adjust operations around what can be sustained rather than what is tactically optimal. These constraints influence battlefield behavior in subtle but important ways. Units with uncertain resupply are less likely to engage in prolonged engagements or exploit breakthroughs aggressively. Defensive postures become more common, not solely because of enemy strength, but due to the need to conserve resources. Over time, this shapes the overall tempo of the conflict, reducing momentum and increasing reliance on artillery and fortifications rather than maneuver. Domestically, the economic burden of sustaining military logistics intersects with civilian life. Budget reallocations toward defense reduce funding available for infrastructure, healthcare, and education. Although official statistics emphasize stability, households experience rising prices and reduced access to goods. The connection between these pressures and the war is not always openly discussed, but it forms part of the broader social context in which public opinion evolves. Support rooted in patriotic messaging can coexist with private frustration when material conditions deteriorate. Information management continues to play a central role in navigating this environment. State narratives focus on resilience and adaptation, highlighting instances of innovation or local initiative. While such stories may be accurate in isolation, they do not fully convey the scale of systemic strain. Independent reporting and social media, despite restrictions, contribute alternative perspectives that circulate within and beyond Russia's borders. The coexistence of these narratives creates an information landscape marked by contradiction rather than consensus. From an international perspective, logistical shortages are interpreted through multiple lenses. For Ukraine and its supporters, they reinforce the belief that sustained pressure can alter the balance over time. For countries maintaining economic or diplomatic ties with Moscow, they raise questions about long-term reliability and risk. Energy markets, trade routes, and security arrangements are all influenced by perceptions of endurance and stability. The humanitarian dimension extends beyond soldiers to civilians in affected regions. Areas near the front experience disruption of food production and distribution, exacerbating scarcity. Displacement and damage to infrastructure limit local capacity to support military units or civilian populations. This creates feedback loops where military demand further strains civilian resources, intensifying hardship and complicating post-conflict recovery prospects. Strategic planning under these conditions requires constant reassessment. Decisions about force deployment, rotation, and negotiation are informed by assessments of what can be sustained materially. While public statements may emphasize determination, internal calculations must account for the cumulative impact of shortages. Over time, the cost of maintaining operations becomes a central factor shaping policy options. Historical parallels offer context but not certainty. Past conflicts demonstrate that states can endure significant hardship, particularly when leadership maintains control over institutions and narratives. However, they also show that prolonged strain can produce sudden shifts when thresholds are crossed. Identifying those thresholds in advance is difficult, making logistics both a tangible and psychological element of warfare. As the conflict continues, the interaction between supply capacity, economic resilience, and political legitimacy remains dynamic. Adjustments in one area produce consequences in others, requiring trade-offs that cannot be avoided indefinitely. Observers track these developments not as isolated incidents, but as indicators of broader trends shaping the war's trajectory. In this environment, the simple question of whether soldiers receive adequate food and equipment becomes emblematic of a larger issue: the capacity of a state to align its ambitions with its resources over time. The answer evolves daily, influenced by decisions made far from the front, as well as conditions on it. The persistence of shortages suggests that this alignment remains incomplete, with implications that extend beyond immediate military outcomes. Ultimately, the significance of these pressures lies in their cumulative effect. Each disrupted convoy, delayed shipment, or unmet need adds to a ledger that measures endurance. While no single factor determines the course of the war, together they shape possibilities and limits. Understanding this process is essential for assessing not only how the conflict is fought, but how it may eventually be resolved within the constraints imposed by material reality.